Found out my nephew was catfishing my elderly mother online to steal her savings. The FBI Cybercrime unit was very interested. Last month, I drove over to my mom's house for our usual Sunday dinner and noticed something different about her. She was practically glowing, humming while she cooked, and kept checking her phone every few minutes with this shy smile I hadn't seen since Dad passed away 3 years ago. When I asked her about it, she got all flustered and said she'd been talking to someone online, a gentleman who understood her and made her feel young again. My stomach dropped immediately because I'd heard too many stories about elderly people getting scammed online. I tried to be supportive while gently asking questions about this mystery man. She told me his name was Marcus and that he was a retired engineer who lived about 2 hours away. They'd been chatting for weeks through a dating app, and he was planning to visit her soon. The way she talked about him made my heart ache because she seemed so genuinely happy, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I watched my mom transform in ways that both warmed my heart and terrified me. She started wearing makeup again, bought new clothes, and even got her hair done at a salon for the first time in months. She was constantly texting someone and would light up whenever her phone buzzed. But then I started noticing other changes too. She seemed more secretive, would quickly close her laptop when I came over, and started making excuses about why she couldn't go out to lunch or visit like we used to. One evening when I stopped by unannounced, I found her crying at her kitchen table with her checkbook open in front of her. She tried to wipe her tears and act normal, but I could see she'd been writing checks. When I asked what was wrong, she broke down and told me that Marcus had been having financial troubles. His daughter needed surgery, and he was embarrassed to ask for help, but my mom wanted to send him money to show she cared about him. She'd already sent him $1,500 the week before. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. I sat down next to her and gently explained that this sounded like a romance scam, that people create fake profiles to target lonely seniors and steal their money. She got defensive and insisted that Marcus was real, that they'd video chatted and he'd sent her photos. She showed me pictures on her phone of a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, and I had to admit they looked legitimate. But something still felt off about the whole situation. The next day, I decided to do some investigating on my own. I asked my mom for Marcus's last name and found his dating profile online. Everything looked normal at first glance, but when I did a reverse image search on his photos, I discovered they were stock photos from a modeling website. My heart sank as I realized my mom was indeed being catfished, but I knew I had to be careful about how I approached this with her. I printed out the evidence and drove to her house, preparing myself for a difficult conversation. When I showed her the stock photos and explained how I'd found them, she stared at the papers for a long time without saying anything. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and admitted she'd suspected something might be wrong but hadn't wanted to believe it. She felt foolish and embarrassed, and I spent the next hour reassuring her that she wasn't stupid and that these scammers were professionals who knew exactly how to manipulate people. But then she dropped a bombshell that changed everything. She told me that Marcus had been asking increasingly personal questions about our family, wanting to know about her children and grandchildren. He'd been particularly interested in hearing about my nephew, her grandson, who'd been struggling financially and had asked her for money several times over the past year. She said Marcus seemed to know details about our family that she didn't remember telling him. A horrible thought started forming in my mind, but I pushed it away because it seemed too awful to be true. I asked my mom to show me some of the conversations she'd had with Marcus, and as I read through them, I noticed that his writing style and the way he phrased things seemed oddly familiar. There were specific expressions and slang terms that reminded me of someone, but I couldn't quite place it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I started going through the messages more carefully. I noticed that Marcus always seemed to be online at the same times my nephew was usually awake, and he never responded during the hours when my nephew was at his job. The coincidences were starting to pile up, but I still couldn't believe that my own family member would do something so cruel to his grandmother. I decided to set up a test. I asked my mom to tell Marcus a fake story about me winning a small lottery prize, something that wasn't true but was believable enough. Within hours of her sending that message, my nephew called me asking if I'd really won some money and if I could help him with his rent. I'd never told anyone about the fake lottery story except my mom, and she'd only shared it with Marcus. The realization hit me like a truck. My own nephew, my sister's son, was catfishing his grandmother and stealing her money. I felt sick to my stomach and didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, but I knew I needed more proof before making such a serious accusation. I also knew that if I was right, this wasn't just family drama anymore. It was elder abuse and fraud. I spent the next few days collecting evidence. I compared writing samples from my nephew's social media posts with Marcus's messages to my mom, and the similarities were undeniable. I also discovered that my nephew had been asking other family members for money around the same time. The Marcus persona had been telling my mom about his financial troubles. The pattern was becoming clear, and I realized this had been going on for much longer than I'd initially thought. Finally, I decided I had to confront my nephew directly. I drove to his apartment and found him at home, looking nervous when he saw me at his door. I told him I knew what he was doing and showed him some of the evidence I'd collected. At first, he tried to deny everything, but when I showed him the writing analysis and the timeline comparisons, he broke down and confessed. He told me he'd started the whole thing as a way to get money from our mom, without her knowing it was him. He'd been struggling with debt and had already borrowed money from her several times, but he was too ashamed to ask for more. He thought he could create a fake persona and get her to send money to help a boyfriend, then pay her back once he got his finances sorted out. But the lie had spiraled out of control, and he'd ended up taking much more than he'd originally planned. I was furious and heartbroken at the same time. This was my nephew, someone I'd helped raise, someone who'd spent countless holidays at my mom's house eating her cooking and receiving her love and generosity. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined, and I struggled to understand how he could have done this to someone who'd always been there for him. But then he told me something that made the situation even worse. He said he wasn't the only one involved. He'd been working with someone else, someone who'd given him the idea and helped him create the fake profile. When I pressed him for details, he admitted that his girlfriend had been the one to suggest the scheme, and she'd been helping him manage the Marcus persona and coaching him on what to say to keep my mom interested and sending money. I realized this was bigger than just a family member making a bad decision. This was an organized fraud scheme, and my mom wasn't the only victim. I told my nephew that he needed to tell me everything, including how much money he'd stolen and whether there were other elderly people being targeted. He broke down completely and admitted they'd been running similar scams on at least 3 other seniors in our area. At that point, I knew I had to involve law enforcement. This wasn't something I could handle as a family matter anymore. I told my nephew that he had 24 hours to come clean to my mom and figure out how to return her money, or I would be calling the police. He begged me not to involve the authorities, saying it would ruin his life and that he'd pay everything back. But I couldn't let him continue to victimize elderly people, even if one of them was my own mother. The next day, I called the FBI's Cybercrime unit and reported what I discovered. I expected them to take a report and maybe follow up eventually, but I was surprised by how quickly they responded. Within hours, I had a federal agent on the phone asking detailed questions about the scheme and requesting all the evidence I'd collected. They told me this type of organized romance scam targeting seniors was a high priority for them. The agent explained that romance scams against elderly people had become a massive problem, with billions of dollars being stolen every year. They were particularly interested in cases where multiple victims were involved, and where the scammers were operating locally rather than from overseas. The fact that my nephew and his girlfriend were running these cons in person made it easier to prosecute and potentially recover money for the victims. I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life, whether to cooperate with the federal investigation against my own family member. I thought about my mom and how devastated she'd been when she realized she'd been fooled. I thought about the other elderly victims who were probably going through the same emotional trauma. In the end, I knew I had to do the right thing, even if it meant my nephew would face serious consequences. The FBI moved quickly once I agreed to cooperate. They had me wear a wire when I met with my nephew again, and they recorded him confessing to the scam and providing details about the other victims. They also set up surveillance on his girlfriend and discovered she'd been running similar schemes in neighboring counties. Within a week, both of them were arrested and charged with multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and wire fraud. The hardest part was telling my mom that her beloved grandson was the one who'd been manipulating her. I'd been dreading this conversation, but I knew she deserved to know the truth. When I explained what had happened, she went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, sadness, and eventually a kind of resigned disappointment. She said she'd suspected something was wrong, but had never imagined it could be someone in our own family. What surprised me most was how my mom handled the situation. Instead of falling apart, she seemed to find strength in knowing the truth. She told me that being deceived by a stranger would have been one thing, but being betrayed by family was something else entirely. She said she was proud of me for doing the right thing, even though it meant turning in our own relative. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. My nephew's girlfriend turned out to have a history of similar scams, and the FBI had been building a case against her for months. My nephew's cooperation and the evidence we'd provided helped them connect her to at least a dozen other victims across 3 states. The scope of the operation was much larger than any of us had realized. During the investigation, I learned details that made the whole thing even more disturbing. My nephew had been sharing personal information about our family with his girlfriend, including photos from family gatherings and stories about my mom's daily routines. They'd used this information to make the Marcus persona seem more authentic and to build a deeper emotional connection with my mom. The level of planning and manipulation was sickening. The most shocking revelation came when the FBI showed me evidence that my nephew had been planning to escalate the scam. They'd found messages between him and his girlfriend discussing ways to get my mom to sign over power of attorney to Marcus, which would have given them access to her entire life savings and her house. If I hadn't discovered what was happening when I did, my mom could have lost everything. As the case progressed, I had to testify before a grand jury about what I'd discovered and how I'd uncovered the scheme. It was surreal sitting in a federal courthouse talking about my own family members' crimes. The prosecutor told me that cases like this were becoming more common as scammers realized that elderly people were vulnerable targets, but having a family member involved made it particularly cruel. The other victims in the case were all elderly people who'd been targeted through dating apps and social media. The FBI connected me with some of them, and hearing their stories was heartbreaking. One woman had lost her entire retirement savings. Another had taken out a second mortgage on her house to send money to her fake boyfriend. The emotional damage was just as devastating as the financial loss. My nephew eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. His girlfriend received a longer sentence because of her prior record and her role as the mastermind of the operation. The court also ordered them to pay restitution to all the victims, though the prosecutor warned us that we'd probably never see most of that money. The aftermath of the whole situation was complicated for our family. My sister was devastated that her son had committed such serious crimes, and she blamed herself for not raising him better. Some family members thought I'd been too harsh in involving the FBI, while others supported my decision. The family dynamics shifted in ways I'm still trying to understand. My mom surprised everyone with how resilient she was throughout the whole ordeal. She started volunteering with a local organization that educates seniors about online scams, sharing her story to help others avoid similar situations. She said that if something positive could come from her experience, she wanted to use it to protect other people from going through what she'd endured. The hardest part for me was dealing with the guilt I felt about my nephew's situation. Even though I knew I'd done the right thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd destroyed his future. I kept thinking about the kid I'd helped teach to ride a bike and taken to baseball games, and it was hard to reconcile those memories with the person who'd manipulated his grandmother for money. But then I'd remember my mom crying at her kitchen table, ready to send more money to someone she thought cared about her, and I'd know I'd made the right choice. The FBI agent told me that my decision to come forward had likely saved other elderly people from being victimized, and that helped me feel better about the situation. The experience taught me a lot about the vulnerability of elderly people in the digital age and how sophisticated these scams have become. It also showed me how family dynamics can be exploited by people who understand them well enough to manipulate them. The fact that my nephew had used his insider knowledge of our family to make his scam more believable was particularly disturbing. Looking back, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts when something felt wrong about my mom's online relationship. If I'd ignored those red flags or convinced myself that I was being paranoid, the situation could have been much worse. My mom could have lost her house and her entire life savings, and other elderly people would have continued to be victimized. The whole experience also made me realize how important it is for families to talk openly about online safety, especially with elderly relatives who might not be as familiar with digital scams. My mom had never heard of catfishing or romance scams before this happened, and she didn't know the warning signs to look out for. Now she's become an expert on the subject and helps other seniors recognize when something might be too good to be true. Today, almost a year later, my mom is doing well and has started dating again, but this time she's much more cautious about meeting people online. She's learned to verify people's identities and to be suspicious of anyone who asks for money or personal information too quickly. She says the experience taught her to trust her instincts and to talk to family members when something feels off. As for my nephew, he's still serving his sentence, and our family is slowly trying to figure out how to move forward. Some relationships have been permanently damaged, but others have grown stronger through the experience. My mom and I have become closer as we've worked through the aftermath together, and I've gained a deeper appreciation for her strength and resilience. The FBI agent who worked on the case told me that elder fraud is one of the fastest growing crimes in the country, with billions of dollars being stolen from seniors every year. Most of these crimes go unreported because victims are embarrassed or don't know where to turn for help. The fact that my nephew was caught and prosecuted was relatively rare, and it happened only because I was willing to get involved and push for justice. The whole situation reinforced my belief that we have to look out for the vulnerable people in our lives, even when it means making difficult decisions. My mom had always been there for our family, and when she needed protection, I had to be willing to step up and do what was right, even if it meant turning in my own nephew. The experience also showed me how important it is to stay involved in elderly relatives' lives and to pay attention to changes in their behavior or circumstances. If I hadn't been visiting my mom regularly and noticed the changes in her demeanor, I might never have discovered what was happening. Regular contact and open communication can be the best defense against these types of scams. In the end, the whole ordeal was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, but it also taught me valuable lessons about family, loyalty, and doing the right thing even when it's hard. My mom's strength and resilience throughout the process inspired me, and I'm proud that we were able to help protect other elderly people from being victimized by the same scheme. The FBI Cybercrime Unit's interest in the case also opened my eyes to how seriously law enforcement takes these crimes, and how much resources they're willing to invest in protecting elderly victims. The agent told me that every case like this that gets prosecuted sends a message to other potential scammers that this type of crime has serious consequences. My mom still gets emotional sometimes when she talks about what happened, but she's channeled that pain into helping others avoid similar situations. She's become a regular speaker at senior centers and community events, sharing her story and educating other elderly people about online safety. She says that if her experience can prevent even one other person from being victimized, then something positive will have come from all the pain and betrayal she endured. The whole experience fundamentally changed how I think about family relationships and trust. It taught me that blood relationships don't automatically guarantee loyalty or honesty, and that sometimes the people closest to us can be the ones who hurt us the most. But it also showed me that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, can lead to positive outcomes for everyone involved. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to involve law enforcement, even though it meant my nephew went to prison. The alternative would have been allowing him to continue victimizing elderly people, including his own grandmother, and I couldn't live with that on my conscience. Sometimes protecting the people we love means making hard choices that others might not understand or support. The case is now closed, but the impact continues to ripple through our family and community. My mom's advocacy work has helped dozens of other seniors learn about online safety, and the publicity around the case has raised awareness about the growing problem of romance scams targeting elderly people. In some ways, the terrible situation has led to positive changes that might not have happened otherwise. I still struggle sometimes with the complexity of the situation and the conflicting emotions it brought up. Part of me will always grieve for the nephew I thought I knew, the one who turned out to be capable of such cruelty toward his own grandmother. But I'm also proud of how my mom and I handled the situation, and how we've used the experience to help protect other vulnerable people. The whole ordeal taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, and that protecting the people we love might mean making decisions that hurt other people we care about. But in the end, my mom's safety and well-being and the safety of other elderly people in our community had to come first. The FBI Cybercrime Unit's interest in the case validated that decision and showed me that we'd been dealing with something much more serious than just a family problem.